Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Nature and Science Podcast. On Nature and Science Podcast, we believe that science does care what you believe. Why? Because science is all about finding objective truth based on verifiable evidence. Please check out our website at natureandsciencepodcast.com to learn more and subscribe. Also, please hit the like button to help us grow this podcast. This episode is all about DNA and genetic counseling. Kira Deneen joins us to discuss the challenges surrounding genetic diseases and the sometimes difficult decisions parents have to make. We will also talk about the revolutionary gene tool CRISPR that is clustered, regularly, interspaced, short palindromic repeats. Stay tuned, you'll find out what that means. She started DNA Today, a genetics podcast in 2012, which also became a radio show in 2014, actually. The podcast has since produced over 140 episodes interviewing experts in the field. So Kira received her Diagnostic Genetic Bachelor's of Science degree at the University of Connecticut and is a certified Cytogenetic Technologist. She received her master's in science in human genetics at Sarah Lawrence College in New York. She is the host of the PhenoTips Speaker Series and currently practices as a genetic counselor in a high-risk prenatal private practice. She is here today to discuss genetic testing. As I mentioned before, we'll talk about the Nobel Prize winning CRISPR genetic editing technique and talk about the overall quality and safety of DNA testing by such companies as 23andMe and Ancestry.com. Kira, welcome to the program. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Don. I really appreciate you giving everybody some background on me so they have some context. Thanks.
Yeah. No, and it was great to talk to you earlier. I'm really excited about the discussion we're going to have today. So tell us what influenced you to begin this journey that you're on, helping people with genetic diseases, and why DNA?
In middle school and high school, my favorite topic when it would roll around would be genetics. So in science classes, I would see that on the schedule and I was like, oh, that's going to be great. That's going to be interesting. So I just kept coming back to it. When I was in high school, I learned about genetic counseling because my mom is a social worker, and you're like, how does that mix? But she had learned about the career and she really loved her own career helping people and helping them process tough times in their life, emotions as a social worker. And I was like, okay, that's cool. I want to have a career where I am passionate about what I'm doing, but for me, it wasn't quite nerdy enough. It needed a little bit more for my personal interest of having that science aspect. And genetics has so much that changes. We are constantly learning more about genetics. And so when it comes to that, that drew me in. I loved in class where I would ask a question, or one of my classmates would ask a question, and the teacher would say, well, not only do I not know, but we don't know yet as scientists. And I thought that was so exciting because I was like, well, maybe in my lifetime we'll have an answer to that. And I just kept coming back to genetics. So, yeah, as you said, I got my undergrad, my bachelor's in the lab side of genetics, and then got my master's more in the counseling side of genetics, kind of becoming a genetic counselor and being able to coach people through what they're experiencing, particularly in their pregnancy. But then, as you said, I also get to, usually I'm on the other side of the mic where you are and interviewing people and talking about what they have experienced or what they're an expert in. So it's just such an interesting area. And as you mentioned, like we'll get into CRISPR and so many really cool technologies that we've developed.
Absolutely. Well, in fact, let's get into that. So you explained a little bit about how you got hooked on genetics, but your podcast is DNA Today. So let's start with DNA. And let's talk about what is DNA. I think people hear it all the time. I mean, you even hear it in truck commercials. This is heavy duty DNA truck, and
Yes, you
all
do.
sorts of other.
I always
Um,
I always like whip my head around. I'm like DNA, and I'm like, oh, they're just using it that way. All right.
and you hear it on police television shows and just about every kind of reference that's out there. So let's talk about it from a biochemical and scientific point of view and really give people an understanding of what is DNA and why it's important in genetics.
So DNA is the blueprint of life. It is the instruction manual that all of our cells, except a few in our brain and our red blood cells, all the rest of our cells have this full instruction manual. They're not using the full manual. They're just going to use the parts that's relevant to them. So if you think of it like an encyclopedia, I'm just going to look at the science stuff, right? I'm not going to look at necessarily literature or something. And so the cells are using just what it needs. And when we're looking at that, it's so interesting because only about 1%, tiny, 1% of our genome is actually made into proteins. And one of those questions I remember asking as a sophomore in high school, or maybe I'm remembering it wrong. Maybe one of my more erudite classmates asked it. But the question was, well, what is this 99% of DNA that isn't made into proteins? And teacher was like, oh, we call that junk DNA. And I'm like, what do you mean that 99% of our genetics is just useless? And in the 15 years since that question was asked, that I was sitting in that classroom, we now understand that the rest of that genetics, the rest of our DNA, the ATCG, that's the letters that make up that DNA language,
And
we
those letters
learned,
and those letters represent chemical bases, actually biochemical molecules. And the A is adenine, the T is thymine, the C is cytosine, and the G is guanine. And there's only one other base, and that's uracil, and that's in RNA. And we're not going to talk specifically about RNA, although it's central to making proteins and doing other things as we've learned in genetics as well. But DNA is an important biomolecule. It's a double helix. It replicates itself, and those bases actually serve as codes for, you mentioned proteins earlier, for coding for amino acids, and then those amino acids are translated into proteins and it's it's a miracle as to how DNA works, and I can understand how you actually got hooked on it. And when DNA makes a mistake, it's called a mutation. So why don't you pick up from there and because that's what you work on is these mutations that happen that cause diseases, and then you end up having to counsel people.
yeah, that's a great explanation of like you explained the central dogma in like, a minute. Amazing. So when we have a misspelling in our DNA, as you said, we refer to that as a mutation. And when we're looking at a report from a laboratory that has found this mutation, they're calling it a pathogenic variant. So a variant is anytime there is a difference in the DNA that we don't normally see, or that is not the most common spelling of a certain gene. And sometimes this spelling is not a big deal. So I'll take my middle name as an example. My middle name is Catherine. You could spell that with a K or you could spell that with a C. It doesn't make a difference, right? You understand and you would read that both to be Catherine. But if you change that to an A, it's no longer Catherine. That means something else. And
Mhm.
so I have to give credit to my friend Catherine Mayo, who came up with that analogy. And I was like, wait, my middle name is Catherine. I can
That's
borrow that from
beautiful.
you.
Yeah.
Because my first name that doesn't work. It's too confusing. Um, so for us to figure out, well, all right, it's spelled differently, but what is the function? How does that affect how that gene is read? and
Mhm.
understood by the body, as you said, understood by the RNA to adapt that from the DNA, then for the RNA to be made into proteins. The way that us as scientists try to figure out that process, it's complicated. So if we have seen it enough times and we see, all right, people that have this spelling difference have this health problem, and we see it enough times, we can say, okay, that's what's leading to this. We have enough statistical evidence to give us that answer. And sometimes it's the opposite, right? A C to a K in Catherine, that doesn't make a difference. That's part of the beautifulness of human diversity, that we're all a little bit
Mhm.
different, right? You look at
Right.
me and Don, there's a lot of differences between us, right?
Mhm.
We've got gender, we've got ethnicity, we've got, I can't quite see the color of your eyes. Mine are blue, so that might be different. So there's a lot of differences between us. One is not better than the other, and it doesn't affect our health. So that's just part of the diversity that we see in the differences in how our genes are spelled. But then there are ones right in the middle of that spectrum that we call variants of uncertain significance or variants of unknown significance, VUS for short.
Mhm.
And these, it's tough because scientists are like, well, we don't have enough data either way to call it benign. That's just beautiful human diversity, or pathogenic, where, oh, this is causing a human health problem. And so sometimes we're stuck in the middle and we need a lot more data. And it's funny you said let's focus on DNA, and I'll be a terrible guest to bring it back to RNA again. That sometimes actually analyzing the RNA can help us figure out which kind of variant it is. Is it that mutation, that pathogenic variant, or it's benign, it's fine. It's just a little interesting difference. So it's very cool that we can look at all of this genetic information and start getting enough. And through projects like all of us, through the NIH and a lot of other projects, we're able to start figuring all that out.
Well,
And
let's
I
let's talk
think in my
about
lifetime we'll get there, right? Like we'll
right.
get to the point where we won't have these VUSs anymore. We'll be able to categorize or classify all of these.
Well, one of them, that we have classified, and there are several that are being worked on, thalassemia, and then, of course, sickle cell anemia. Those are point mutations, or that's where, in your language, the misspelling is, significant, and it is just one letter, so that K and C in Catherine gets changed to an A, and now you're not Catherine anymore. Nobody knows who you are, or what to do with you.
Catherine. That doesn't mean that. That's different. Yeah.
Exactly. So, in a practical sense, though, in a very serious sense, you have something like sickle cell anemia, and I would assume you've had patients with thalassemia or with sickle cell anemia, which is a change in just one of those letters. In the case of sickle cell anemia, you end up having red blood cells that are sickle shaped, and they end up not being able to take up oxygen. And it's a very serious disease, mostly occurring in Africans, in African Americans. And thalassemia, I think, is more in the Jewish population, if I'm not mistaken. I know you'll correct me if I'm wrong. Um,
Mediterranean area. Yeah, usually
right.
for beta alpha thalassemia. Yeah.
So, somebody comes to you, a parent of a child, or they want to have a child. Both of them have a misspelled letter. They both are positive for sickle cell anemia. They say, I want to have a child. What I need to be counseled. Should I have this baby or not? Because it's a heritable disease. It's heritable. It can be passed on to my child. Where do you begin? What do you say? What is genetic counseling?
Yeah, that's a great question and a great example too. Because as you said, I meet with people that most of the time they're pregnant. And so I either am ordering genetic testing after we go through what are the options for genetic testing, that they understand the test enough to be able to make an informed decision on, do I want this or not? Is this going to be helpful for me and my family and decision making during pregnancy? And so if someone comes back that them and the other biological parent are both, as you explained, carriers of sickle cell, they don't have the full condition themselves. Carriers of sickle cell can have some anemia, so they can have some health problems. Most of the time, carriers of these conditions that are autosomal recessive, as you're explaining, that both biological parents need to be carriers for the baby to possibly inherit that. Um, and that's a 25% chance if everybody remembers drawing those Punnett squares. It's 1 out of 4 boxes. That's what we're talking about here.
They remember their Mendelssohn genetics. Yes.
Exactly. Yes. I don't think we could see it, but I got a little statue of Mendel behind me somewhere. And he's holding his little peas, of course.
Right.
That's a whole nother episode there. But so when we're talking through this, most people that are carriers of one of these conditions, that there's a whole long list, hundreds and hundreds of conditions that we can test for. Most of them, if you're a carrier for that, you don't have any symptoms. I'm a carrier for a condition. I've found one so far of the testing I've done, and I don't have any symptoms from that. Sickle cell, a little bit different. They can have anemia, some other features. But when it comes to the pregnancy, as you're asking about, and they say, okay, like talk me through this, what they have done to that point is something called carrier screening. So just identifying, are they a carrier or not? Or is their partner or the sperm or egg donor carrier or not? And if we find that both biological parents are carriers, as I said, there's that 1 in 4 chance or 25% chance baby has inherited that. And part of the conversation at that point is having me educate them so they can tell me what's best for them. It is not my job to tell them what to do, not at all. So think of me like a guidance counselor, and I'm sitting down with a high schooler, and I'm like, all right, you say you want to go to college. Let's look at the different colleges that might be a good fit for you. I don't care where the kid goes to college, right? Like, makes no
Mhm.
difference to me. It's not my life. But I want them to choose the college that's going to be best for them, right? They're going to be happiest at. It's going to be rigorous enough for them. It's going to be a good degree. All of these different factors. I don't care where they go, right? I
Right.
just want to make sure it's a fit for them.
Right.
Same with patients I meet with. I don't care what testing they choose to do. I don't care if they decide to continue a pregnancy or not. What I care about is, are they making decisions that's best for them and their family? And one of those decision making aspects is, well, do you want to do further testing? So
Mhm.
we're sitting down, we're talking with this couple and or this person, depending on their family structure and their support system. And they say, well, I do want to know more information. You're telling me there's a 25% chance this baby has sickle cell. I want to know, do they have it? Do they not? And doing that would involve a procedure called an amniocentesis, where I say we, but the doctor, I don't actually do this. I'm not a doctor. The doctor takes a needle to go through the stomach and collect some amniotic fluid. And that's what the baby is floating in. And by taking a little bit of fluid, we can actually get fetal cells because, Don, as we're sitting here, we're shedding skin cells onto our desk.
Mhm.
Baby's doing the same thing in utero. So we can test those cells for sickle cell and say, does baby either have no mutations in the sickle cell gene? HBB is the gene. Do they have one mutation that makes them a carrier like their parents? They could have some mild symptoms, but in general, tends not to have severe health problems. Or the third option is that they have sickle cell. They have the 2 copies of that gene is mutated, has that pathogenic variant, and as you were saying, has 1 letter difference. That's all that causes it, that point mutation. And then we can, say to the parents, well, now we have further information and they can do different aspects. They can make different decisions with that information. But a lot of people find that it can be helpful to have a diagnosis during pregnancy. It's
Mhm.
not always that people are choosing to end a pregnancy. That depends on so many different factors, right? But also maybe they want to prepare to have a child with that condition. They say, I'm not going to do anything different medically during my pregnancy, but I want to take time to learn about the condition. Maybe meet doctors that my kid is going to end up being with,
That's
meet
a good
people in the
point.
community, right? Like other
Right.
parents that can say, this is what it's like to raise a kid with sickle cell and what is involved. So we're covering a lot of information, right? Because I'm whittling down what I talk about in like an hour into a couple
True.
minutes here. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's really counseling them through. That's where that title genetic counselor comes from. Is like you're processing this information along with the emotions, which are really often scary, anxiety. Like we're also talking through that, right? I'm not just teaching them. It's
Right.
both.
So it's one of those situations, as you said earlier, to recap, where you're assisting them by giving them information that they can then make a decision on their own. but they can't make a, and it's then it becomes an informed decision, of course, and that's what you want. Just so our listeners know, I hope I can relieve a little bit of anxiety. You mentioned amniocentesis, which is a very invasive process and can also
Yes.
cause a lot of anxiety. Well, now there's a new test. I can't remember the name of it. Maybe you're familiar with it, where amniocentesis is really no longer necessary in most practices. They can actually now go in and take a blood sample from the mother and diagnose many, including sickle cell anemia. Now they've gotten to the point where they can do that, which should relieve a little bit of the stress in parents. And this goes back to what you were talking about earlier and the progress that's being made. It's being made every day, and it gets better and better. Hopefully it makes your job a little bit easier. And you also mentioned testing. So how accurate are these tests? These genetic tests, they're home tests. There's the 23andMe, I think it's called, and there's
Yep.
Ancestry DNA, very popularized, and people get their results back. And I don't think a lot of times they have enough information when they get the test back to know how to respond appropriately. So, do you have people coming to you after taking some of these tests? And again, how safe are they and accurate?
Yeah, yeah, great question. So I, in general, think of genetic tests kind of in two buckets. Diagnostic tests, like we were talking about with the amnio, where we can say baby has condition, baby does not have condition. It is a binary answer, right? We're getting an answer. Whereas the other kind of testing is really screening. And so when we're looking at screening, that comes back with a high chance or a low chance for certain conditions.
Mhm.
And really, any in the pregnancy space, most, if not all, blood tests we're doing is considered screening. It's coming back usually low risk for all conditions. And I think the test you're alluding to at the beginning there is called non-invasive prenatal screening. And this is a simple blood draw, usually one, sometimes two tubes of blood from the pregnant person. And what is so cool, and I've talked about this for over 10 years, and I think it's still so interesting that when someone's pregnant, there is DNA that comes off their placenta and floats in their bloodstream. So by taking that blood sample, labs can then isolate the DNA that is coming from the placenta and screen for these genetic conditions. So these conditions include like Down syndrome, other extra missing chromosome conditions. So once we started having that clinically, a little over 10 years ago, 2011, 2012, somewhere around there, a lot less people were doing amnios because we had this really good screening. Because when we have a normal result from that, or to be more specific, a low risk or low chance for all the
Mhm.
conditions that are screened for most of the conditions, including Down syndrome, there's a 1 in 10,000 chance the screening missed that condition. To me, that's really good. That's way under a percent. You're probably better at math than I am, Don. And that's way under a percent. 1 in 10,000? Like that's really, really low. So because of that, a lot of people do that screening during pregnancy. And then they're like, okay, well, if the chance is 1 in 10,000 now, they're like, I don't want to do that invasive procedure. I don't want a needle through my stomach. I don't want to have all the potential complications that can come with an amnio, including a miscarriage.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's a lot less common, but then sometimes it's still the
Necessary.
only test. Yeah, sometimes it's the only test to get an answer. And some people say, all right, I understand that's the only way to get an answer, but I don't need the answer that bad. I don't want to do the amnio. And that's fine with me. Again, I don't care what they do. All right. I'm just like, okay, cool. We're making the right decision for you. But to answer your questions about the other kind of genetic testing through, we call them direct consumer companies. So anything where you can just go online and order it yourself without a healthcare provider.
Mhm.
So 23andMe, Ancestry, there's a lot of these. And I do want to offer disclosure that I have been paid by 23andMe in the past to run advertisements. So I always like being very clear with that. Um, so what's really interesting about these is that they are so universal, right? Like, for 50, $100, depending on which sale you get, you can learn a lot. You spit into a tube, you mail it off, and you end up getting all of this interesting information. And some of it is quite accurate, and others, it's not as, I don't want to say accurate, but not as comprehensive.
Mhm.
So if we look at ancestry, for an example, because I think that is the area that a lot of people know of this genetic testing that you could do at home for, right? Like ancestry DNA is literally named after that, right?
Right.
And I've done a lot of these companies, right? I've done all the ones I've mentioned and more. And when I have gotten my results, it is luckily consistent with family stories, right? My family stories is we're from England, Poland, Ireland. Specifically in Ireland, we're from Cork, Ireland, is where both of one a branch of family is from. And luckily, when I did my testing, it actually came up. Cork, Ireland was like a hot spot of like a big concentration there. Now, if my ancestry wasn't these European countries, it probably wouldn't be as accurate in terms of, I shouldn't say accurate, but as specific. That's more what
Sure.
I'm looking for, as specific.
Hmm.
So it's possible, Don, if you do the testing, being a different ethnicity than me, you may get a much more general area than me. And the reason for that is because there's a lot more people of more recent European ancestry than others. So there's a much bigger pool that they can compare my DNA to and get specific with than people of other ancestries.
If you don't mind, I want to interject here
Yeah.
for our listeners that we've done two episodes where we delved into this deeply. At the very beginning, one on polymerase chain reaction, which made so much of this, ancestry DNA and 23andMe wouldn't be in existence if it wasn't for the discovery of that tool. And we just did a podcast on that. And then we had another person on, Mika Anders, who runs an ancestry family search company, and we delved into this in detail. So I just want to let our listeners know they can go back if they want more detail on this, because we're not going to get into the full detail of how those things are possible. But we do that in those other two episodes. So it's something that our listeners might want to go back and check out.
Yeah, that's awesome. You've done that. And a lot of people know PCR, you said polymerase chain reaction from COVID. Like people talk about, oh, we're getting a PCR test. So I feel like
Right.
now the public is aware of that term that they weren't 5 years ago.
Right. And just since we mentioned it, because I hate to throw around these acronyms without people understanding what we're talking about, that particular tool allows you to reproduce a whole bunch of snippets of DNA, reproduce them, replicate them, which you weren't able to do. And then from all of those pieces, then you can analyze, because you can't analyze anything with just one sample. You have to literally have thousands, and this tool allows you to replicate individual snippets of DNA and individual genes. Even it's just a very powerful tool that's out there. It's really great, and so I really hope our listeners will go back and listen to those two episodes and find out more about that. So, what is your advice for people considering a career in genetics? What do you tell them?
Do it. I'm so biased. Um, I think if you're interested in this, it is just such a fascinating area. And what I like about it is I'm 29 for reference, that
Mhm.
I am looking forward to hopefully a very long career where I'm somewhat old that people are like, you gonna retire soon? I'm gonna be like, no, I'm still so into this. That's what I hope. That's my vision for my future. And one of the reasons I think it's gonna keep me so engaged is because, as we said, we're learning so much all the time about genetics, but also there's so many different areas to go into, right? Like we've bounced around with a couple different genetic topics today. And, I've been working with in the pregnancy space for like, a bit over 4 years. In a few years, whatever, if I say, you know what, I feel like I've done these pregnancy conversations a lot, I can say, you know what, now I'm going to go work in cancer. Now I'm going to work in neurology, cardiology, ophthalmology. There's so many different areas that genetic counselors and people in genetics can work that even if you kind of get tired of one area, go jump to another. And even just different kind of roles. So there are people in genetics that work in laboratories that are in wet labs, like actually moving sample around and testing samples. Dry labs, as we talked about, of curating variants. Is this a genetic change that will cause a human health problem? There are genetic counselors that help other healthcare providers understand the testing and kind of coach them through that and teach them so that they can teach their patients. And these are just off the top of my head. Um, I think because of that, it's such an interesting career and it's growing so much that within genetics, there's just so much. And a more recent area of genetics that's not genetic counseling to provide a better answer is genomic health analysts. And they're kind of what I'm talking about in terms of like curating those variants and looking through all of this massive big data, right?
Hmm.
Our genome is massive.
Right.
So figuring that out, I mean, so there's just so many interesting jobs, and there's a lot of jobs that just don't exist now that people will be doing that are students now. So I highly recommend just exploring what are the different pathways in a genetics career, what are different jobs, what does that look like? And just try to get job shadowing, which can be really hard nowadays, especially with hospitals
Yeah.
and other healthcare settings, a little bit more stringent in this endemic that we're in with COVID. But just reach out and say, hey, can I buy you a coffee and chat with you for half an hour about your job and just learn more about it? These are called
Mm.
informational interviews. And students now, it's such a standard to do. And you get to learn so much and ask them the hard questions. What do you hate about your job? What do you
Mm.
wish was different? Things like that. Don't just ask them what they like about it, because if what they hate about it is something you can never deal with, then maybe that's not your career. Knowing careers that aren't a match is just as important as knowing careers that are. So just get out there, talk to people, take courses, listen to more of Don's episodes to learn more about science and everything. Just expose yourself, read interesting books, go on Goodreads, just type in genetics and just see what comes up. Yeah, I mean, I
Absolutely.
could
Well,
recommend so many things.
no, I know, and we'll talk about that a little bit more at the end. But um, so that our listeners get a understanding of how broad this subject is, but focus on one of the things, circling back to what we've already talked about, there's also careers in gene editing, and that's going in. And so you have that letter in sickle cell anemia that's been changed, that point mutation. The question in genetics, and I actually wrote a paper on this 50 years ago when
Wow.
I was in school. Can you go in and gene edit? Can you actually repair a gene? And of course, now you can do that, and it's already happened, and it's happened with the genetic tool called CRISPR, which I wanted to talk a little bit about. So you have something like sickle cell anemia with this point mutation, which I think our listeners understand what that means now. And you want to go in and you want to repair that gene. So I mentioned clustered regularly interspace short palindromic repeats. That's the fancy or difficult scientific name for how these letters are arranged in a system, a biomolecule within the cell that facilitates repair of DNA. And CRISPR is the tool that's used. It was discovered by two wonderful women that won the Nobel Prize for their work, for their discovery. It was just fantastic, this gene editing tool, and it's used quite extensively now. Can you explain a little bit about what CRISPR is and how it works and how it goes in and repairs a particular gene?
Yeah, definitely. I think, as I said, CRISPR is one of my favorite areas of genetics and, gene editing. There's just so many conversations to have within it. CRISPR, as you said, is this technology that we've developed, and we actually discovered it. So it naturally exists in bacteria, and it's bacteria's way of having like an active immune system. And they were able to learn this, that when a bacteria would be exposed to some virus, something, it would chop it up, the DNA, and actually keep some of it like a record. So it would say, okay, next time I come across this, I'll know what this is and I'll know to fight it. So similar to a vaccine in that way, right? When we get vaccines, we're keeping a little part, and it's so our immune system remembers, hey, remember, if you see this, go deal with it. Make sure you fight this one. Send out the armies, fight this one. And so we discovered this in bacteria. And then some of these brilliant scientists, like Jennifer Doudna that you mentioned, which there's an awesome book called Code Breaker by Walter Isaacson, that is like a 500-page book that kept me entertained in COVID. And we, as scientists, were able to develop this into a technology where we could actually use it to edit our human genetics and say, all right, let's use these molecular scissors, go into DNA, cut a piece out, probably a piece that has a problem, right? Like you're talking about in the HBB gene, that point mutation for sickle cell. So that one letter change. Let's cut out that part, put in part of DNA that doesn't have that mutation, and then kind of, glue it back together, and then we're all good to go. And obviously, that's a very simple explanation, but that's basically what's happening. And what is so exciting about why you're kind of alluding and bringing up sickle cell and CRISPR is because about a year ago, the first FDA approved treatment using CRISPR for a genetic condition was passed, and that is for sickle cell. And I had the absolute honor of interviewing the first person that does not have any sickle cell symptoms, and she had very severe ones. She has no symptoms now since her CRISPR treatment, and she was the first person to get this in 2019 as part of a clinical trial. And for those that want to check it out, our conversation was so interesting. It's 2 episodes of DNA Today, 288 and 289. And this person's Victoria Gray, and she's just this amazing patient advocate, so inspiring. And her symptoms of sickle cell, for those that don't know what those symptoms are, is, as Don was explaining, usually our red blood cells are kind of a nice, like donut shape, and they're able to flow through our veins and arteries. So through our blood system. And people with sickle cell, that is shaped like a sickle. So it doesn't flow as easy. It gets stuck places. And because of that, that can cause these pain crises. And I don't have sickle cell, but from what I've heard from many people that do have it, it is incredibly painful. In these instances, they're usually going to the ER to get medication to help with this. And because it affects people that are mostly of African descent, there's a lot of medical racism around this too. And so there are just so many problems to get into here. But what is the light at the end of the tunnel is that we have this FDA approved treatment, not cure, but treatment. For some people, they might have no symptoms after treatment. Others might just have an alleviation of symptoms, but it is remarkable. And I'm so happy that this is the first condition that has this FDA approved treatment because, as I was saying, there's just such a history of people with sickle cell being ignored or not taken seriously. And it's such a wonderful thing that we have something. It is not an easy fix to go through this. That's quite a decision, because it basically involves sort of like a bone marrow transplant. You take the bone marrow cells out of a person, you CRISPR them up. So you take those molecular scissors, you paste it in the new gene, and then you put it back in the person. And so this is a process. It's not something people just jump to, but
Well,
it's exciting.
yeah, it is exciting, but let me circle back and on something that you said because I think it's important for our listeners to understand. You mentioned the racism and somehow the fact that, well, because this disease is primarily in people of African descent, it hadn't for some time received the attention that it should have. But this is all part of the human family and human evolution. And I think our listeners need to understand that sickle cell, uh, I don't know if it's proper to call it an evolutionary disease, but it is an evolutionary disease. It really came about as a result of over time, Africans responding evolutionarily to malaria, the disease of malaria. And those people in the population, the African population that produced sickle cells, survived malaria far better than others. So, through natural selection and over a whole lot of time, this particular genetic mutation became prominent in the African population, and it was a way of coping with malaria. And of course, it's not just in the African population. Other populations ended up having it too because of diaspora and people spreading around the world. And so it's important from a science literacy point of view for people to understand how these particular diseases arise in populations, in certain populations, and why they're prevalent there. And I think it's important for our listeners to understand that. So I'm glad we're talking about it in that context too. But we should rush to talk about something controversial. I know people
Yes,
love
let's do
controversy.
it.
So, so about 3 years ago, there was the CRISPR baby controversy. And this is where the ethical problems come in of genetically engineering babies using this tool. And it's done by taking embryos prior to them being implanted in a mother's womb and genetically engineering them for various features. And there's a Chinese doctor, they call him a renegade, but he used this tool to CRISPR up, as you said earlier,
Yes.
genetically engineered to be more precise, these two embryos, which ended up being twin babies that were born with a genetic um, trait that allowed them not to have a particular disease. And that trait it then gets passed on to their generation. So it's not just, and some people call it a gene drive. That's another term that gets bandied about that you should understand. But it's it became very controversial because, of course, you could start engineering babies to be faster runners and smarter human beings, or
Mhm.
for a whole lot of other techniques or traits, phenotypic traits. And is that ethical? You want to say a little bit about what you think about this, particularly since you do genetic counseling, and somebody might come to you and say, well, I want my embryo engineered so it doesn't have sickle cell anemia, or it doesn't have beta thalassemia, or some other genetic heritable disease.
Yeah, this one is so layered, right? Anything in the bioethics space, it's like, you could have a full discussion for days about this. And I think what is important with this is looking at what is health related issues and what is not. And even that question, that's debatable.
Mhm.
And so when it comes to this, when we look at this Chinese scientist that did this, it was end of 2018 when the babies were born. So it means he did it early 2018. And I remember the day I saw the headlines of this because it was just like, oh my gosh, it happened. I knew it would happen at some point. I didn't think it'd be that soon, but that's kind of genetics. I'm always thinking things are going to happen later. It moves fast, but it's just so interesting that what he decided to do it for. So, as you said, he changed the genes allegedly. We also haven't had confirmation of this. His presentation was
That's true.
quite all over the place. But,
It's a very
you
good
know,
point.
yeah, we think he did this. This is what he claims to have done. And I think he did. I don't know how successful each cell was edited, but I think some of them at least were. So with the embryos, he CRISPR them up, as we're saying, and basically edited it so that the babies would have more immunity against HIV, which is quite a choice because, as far as I can remember, and maybe fact check this in the show notes, that the pregnant person, the biological mother, also the genetic mother, didn't have HIV. So there wasn't a risk to passing this on to baby any more than an average baby. So I don't know why he chose this condition as opposed to so many others. Like, let's say baby has some other genetic condition where a couple is only going to create embryos that have that condition, or they did multiple rounds of IVF, in vitro fertilization, where you take egg and sperm and put it together in a lab, and then you have the option of doing genetic testing on that embryo, testing, instead of engineering. And let's say someone can only make babies that have a certain condition. with their partner. That to me would be a more appropriate time to say, let's take advantage of CRISPR and maybe do this. But even that, the big difference between editing embryos and editing someone that is an adult already living is what you're passing on to the next generation. So if you're editing embryos, their sperm or eggs are also going to have that change, presumably. Now, when you're editing, as we talked about, like Victoria Gray with sickle cell, she had CRISPR done, even if she had more children, which she has four beautiful children. I don't know if she'll have more, but if she did, then she wouldn't pass that on because that's a change that did not affect her eggs.
Right.
And that is huge because let's say the CRISPR didn't work the way we thought, and it had what we call off target effects, where it didn't just edit the one gene we're focused on, it edited some others. It's like, if you're doing archery and you're like not getting a bullseye every time. Sometimes you're kind of on the edge of the target, you get in the woods. Like, we're not always hitting exactly the bullseye. So that's such a worry because now these genetic changes that were humanly done are now introduced into our population. That to me is the scariest part of this. Not just what the twins could experience, and there also was a third baby born from a different set of parents around this time too. Um, but what health problems could they have? That's a whole list, right? We don't know. What if it affected a gene that then caused a genetic condition? And you're like, well, all right, great. Maybe the bullseye happened, but also these off-target effects.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a big problem, and that there, because CRISPR is relatively easy to use in labs compared to other genetic technology that it's really labor intensive. You got to know what you're doing, the expertise. CRISPR is relatively easy. That makes it scary because, quote unquote, anyone in the lab could do it. So
Mm-hmm.
also regulation wise, the Chinese scientist that we're referring to, he did not have the approval of his institution to do this, and he served jail time for this.
Yes.
So, and I believe now he's out of jail because it's been about 6 years since he made this announcement that he did
Yeah, he
this.
served for 3 years. He's out of jail and he's back doing the same thing, we understand.
Mm,
He hasn't stopped. And so there's still controversy swirling around what he's doing. He's taking a little bit different approach, but he feels very strongly, from what I've read from his writings and from what other news reports have said, that what he's doing is not ethical. It's important for human beings. It's part of our, he even uses the evolutionary argument. It's just part of,
yeah.
human evolution. It's what we human beings do. So why shouldn't
And
we?
that's debatable. Yeah.
So, well, he has very sophisticated arguments, which we won't go into right now, but he argues, to the contrary, that why shouldn't we be doing it? You're arguing why we should. I'm arguing, or you're arguing why we shouldn't do it ethically. I'm arguing why we should do it ethically. And
Yeah.
he's saying, hey, we just have different ethics. So, and then
Right.
of course it leads to the philosophical question of what is ethics. And but our listeners do need to know that there's a whole association, that international association that's now overseeing the use of CRISPR and confronting these kinds of questions and trying to make different decisions. And we'll put those in the show notes, and people will be able to go to my website at natureandsciencepodcast.com and learn more about this too. We'll have a whole page on it as well.
And I'll
So,
just say I'm not necessarily against it, but more just we need to take pause
mhm,
and really discuss all these potential downstream effects. I think there will come a point where we are using CRISPR and hopefully in this ethical way, which depends how you define that, but in a way that is smart. We're thinking it through of the potential consequences so that we can use it in these ways to prevent conditions.
sure,
So I think it could be great and but it's also scary. Just because we can doesn't mean we necessarily should.
sure.
And that's a classic question and statement in bioethics. And yeah, it's complicated, but that's why I love it.
Well, our approach should be nuanced, I believe, and I pretty much agree with the way that you sum that up as well. So, what for you has been the most difficult aspect of genetic counseling? Let's circle back to the very beginning there with what you've been involved in for most of your professional career. What's the most difficult aspect of genetic counseling for you?
Yeah, I would say there's a list. So it's just keeping up with genetics and what changes and making sure I have the most updated information to pass along to my patients. That is challenging. I think being the host of a genetics podcast, we have over 300 episodes. That helps me because I'm having conversations like this almost every day. So I'm learning from, the top people in genetics in the world. So that certainly helps keep me engaged and updated. But I think being able to set aside my personal views and what I might do in a situation, set that aside while I'm having those conversations and identify my biases so
Hmm.
that it's more clear to me so that I don't have them trickle into my counseling. And I think that's tough for every genetic counselor. I don't think that's something that will ever be like, oh, I figured it out, right? That's going to be, it's one of those things like people aren't like, oh, I'm personally developed. I'll never have any more personal development in my life, right? We're in different decades of our life and everything. And like, I'm sure you'd agree with that, right? It's like you're still learning. Otherwise, you wouldn't be doing a podcast, right? That's part of like learning and everything.
Exactly, exactly.
So I think it's important to understand that. And I've never been pregnant. I hope to be at some point in my life, and have a family and everything. But, something that I think like, interesting, a patient's doing that. I wouldn't do that. It's like, why is that relevant here? It's not, right? And this is just internal thoughts, right? This is just like
Hmm.
the monologue happening in my head sometimes. But identifying that is really helpful. And I think having conversations with other colleagues that are also close friends is very helpful because you could just talk openly about that. And like, yeah, I caught myself kind of thinking this. And I just want to make sure that I'm not having that affect the conversations I'm having with patients and helping them. So that's a whole aspect. And I think just working on helping to counsel people and just have them like hold space for them to be upset that this is not news that they expected to have
Hmm.
and making sure that I'm saying things in a neutral way. So even when we were talking earlier about different screenings, I try to say high and low chance because chance is a neutral term. Whereas if I said high or low risk, risk has a negative connotation to it. So when I'm talking about that, say for Down syndrome, I like saying, oh, low chance for Down syndrome. I'm not putting hopefully not putting a negative connotation on that because for someone that may receive, you have a high chance for this baby to have Down syndrome, that may not be a negative thing for them. For a lot of people, maybe it would be, but I think it's important that's part of kind of that non-biased neutrality that I'm attempting to have. And I think that is so important in the reproductive and pregnancy space. It is obviously in our country, termination abortion has been a hot button issue for decades, right? So even before Roe and now after Roe. And I think it's just important to come at it that I am a professional providing expertise and helping them through their thought processes, their emotions, their decision making. But I get to be that third party where I don't have a say. I'm not their partner that's going to be co-parenting possibly, right? I'm not their mother that's going to be a grandparent to this baby. I want to be that neutral person that can help process that with them. So there's a lot of nuances with it that makes it interesting, that doesn't make it the same, but also always challenges me. And it's really hard. And you look back, you're like, well, could I have handled that conversation better and different? And just always trying to come at it that way. And I'm never going to get to a point where I'm a perfect genetic counselor. I know exactly how to do this. I do this great every time. Nah, I'm
Yeah.
human.
Well, let's talk about the human aspect as we wrap this up with the final question. So, I know you're young, you volunteered that you're 29 years old,
I put it
but
out
is
there.
but is there something that's happened to you in this journey that you're on? in genetic counseling that's been transcendent, that changed you in a way that you would never have anticipated?
It's such a deep question, Don. Now I have to come up with a deep answer. So I think it's not a specific moment or a specific story, anecdote that I can pull to say this is when I really changed. But I think what changes me the most on a continuous basis is hearing from people and their stories and what has impacted them. I think especially through DNA Today, where I get to do a lot of interviews with people that have genetic conditions or their child has a genetic condition and they're the main person taking care of them and is their advocate. And I think hearing from those people and what they've experienced and what feedback they have for the medical community, that to me is what changes me the most and humbles me and reminds me of this is why I do what I do in terms of being a clinician and a healthcare provider and having me have an appreciation for what they've been through and knowing that when I am talking with a parent that they're like, okay, I want to continue this pregnancy. I want to learn about this condition. I am not the best person to teach them about that condition. I can say, well, here's your textbook answers. I can give you statistics. I can tell you what the symptoms are going to be. I can tell you, what does that lifespan look like? All different facts. But I cannot tell you about the lived experience. And that's where I say, I can answer some of your questions, but in order to get a much more comprehensive answer, I would love to connect you with someone else that either has this condition or has a family member with the condition and has parented that person. And I think knowing what I can and can't do is really important as a genetic counselor, knowing where my limits are. And I say all the time, I don't know. I say that more than I know.
Right.
And saying, I will find the answer for you, or I'm going to find a person that can answer that for you and connect you. But I think hearing from people and their experiences is what really shapes me to be a better genetic counselor and a better podcast host, I think,
And
to
a
be
better
able
human
to
being,
know, and a better
and a
human
better
being,
human
right?
being, I would say.
Yeah.
I mean,
I
because
mean,
everything you've
yeah,
described talks about you being a better human being, and it speaks to you becoming a wiser person. So it seems to me that if anything has happened, it's imparted some wisdom, and it's made you deeply self-aware
so
and
much.
introspective about your approach to your work, and I think that's laudable. Kira
Yeah.
Deneen, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate you coming on the show and talking about these issues. They're extremely timely and important.
Well, thank you so much, Don. You're a great host and you're very knowledgeable too of saying, all right, let's take this little lesson here and explain this. And I so appreciate your time and insight. And for listeners that stuck around for the whole episode, hope you've enjoyed our conversation. If you want more genetics content because you've listened to all of Don's episodes that are related to this, then you can head over to DNA Today on all podcast apps wherever you're listening to this.
Excellent. Thank you, Kira. Thank you for joining us on this episode. I hope you enjoyed the conversation about genetic counseling. In the next several episodes, we explore cancer from the physical to the psychological and nutritional. We speak with Dr. Wendy Garvin Mayo, who introduces the concept of collaborative cancer care, two oncologists from the University of North Carolina, and a clinical nutritionist who helps patients with their diet. Please go to our website at natureandsciencepodcast.com and subscribe so that you don't miss an episode. As always, stay safe, share happiness, and remember, never stop questioning. Curiosity has its own